Hey guys, Andrew here with Cursed Media. Trevor's behind the camera, putting everything together. He does all the hard stuff, filming, producing, editing, all the stuff that I don't know how to do, but I know how to talk and make myself sound stupid. So today we're gonna take a look at this beautiful Alfa Romeo Stelvio Veloce. It's been a while since we made a video. I know we say this every time. We're gonna try to make more videos and update it more often. Just unfortunately, life gets in the way. But we're filming this here in December of 2023. As you probably know, the 24 Stelvios and Giulias have started to roll out. You might have even seen some on the roads. Alfa Romeo claims that they are all new, completely ground up, brand new car. It's literally the same car. They changed a couple of things. They revised the headlights a little bit, the taillights. The headlights are now full LED units. These are HID or high intensity discharge. I think they definitely look better and they definitely kind of freshen the car up a little bit, but it's not a drastic change. They also added down in the lower grille some extra gloss black plastic. Not anything drastic. There's a couple of small changes inside as well in the 24s, but overall mechanically, it's the same car. So even if you're looking at 24s, this is really going to be pretty pertinent and accurate to that between the 23 and the 24. If you can still find a 23 on the lot at your local dealership and you don't mind having a 23 over a 24, I'd recommend trying to negotiate a deal on one, because there's a Stelvio Sprint at the local dealership here and they're advertising a $12,000 discount. That doesn't even include Alfa Romeo's rebates and incentives. So with those rebates and incentives, depending on what you qualify for, you could be talking about $16,000, $17,000, even $18,000 off the price of these cars right now, which is pretty substantial. And if it's really outside the budget, that might just be just enough to kind of bump you back within the budget. So definitely worth taking a look. And we'll go into some of the differences when we jump inside the car as well between the 24s, but they're pretty minimal. So this particular Stelvio is the Veloce trim. This is kind of a mid-level, higher trim. This is just below, in 23 it would have been just below the Estrema, which is the highest level. The Estrema being the highest 2-liter version of this car, and then you go up to the Quadrifoglio, obviously. The Estrema for 24 is replaced with the Competizione. The big differences between the Veloces and the Estremas or the Competiziones is the adaptive suspension, which allows you to adjust the damper settings on the fly. So the Veloce trim, appearance-wise, you're gonna get some additional blacked out trim. You're gonna get the blacked out roof with the panoramic sunroof standard as well, blacked out mirrors. Something that I find kind of odd is that they did black trim, but they left the emblems chrome, which I actually don't dislike on this Alfa Rosso exterior color, but I just think it would have looked a little more cohesive with black emblems, but easy enough to change if you decide to do so. The 23 Veloces are gonna have the body color wheel arches as well as the body color rear valance. The 24s go to black trim for the arches and rear valance. I personally am not a fan of that. It makes it look more truckish and more SUV-like. I think this is a little more sleek looking. But other than that, there's not going to be too many changes outside. Come around to the back. You do have a pretty aggressive rear diffuser. And you have some big, fat exhaust tips back there. They're black on this version. And you do have the real tips kind of protruding inside there. A lot of people don't like the faux tips. The reason they do that, a couple different reasons, but primarily being if you ever got into a car accident, your car got rear-ended or you backed into something, it's gonna push the rear valance forward, but it's not gonna push the exhaust forward and potentially damage the engine. So something to keep in mind. I know real exhaust tips are cooler, but it's just a note, something to think about. So overall, I think this is a really, really good looking car, especially in this color. I think that's kind of the quintessential color right there, that red Alfa Romeo. The wheels, I'm not hugely crazy about. I like the design of them, and they're very Alfa Romeo in their appearance, but I just don't love kind of the machined face. I think I'd prefer if they were all in color. Easy enough to paint, or you can replace them, obviously. But we can jump on in, guys, and start going over interior stuff. All right, guys, so I don't really want to waste a lot of time going over specs and stuff like that and how many square centimeters there are from the headrest to the ceiling to the floor. I don't think anybody really is too interested in that stuff. But I do want to talk about the trunk in this thing, because if you're coming from a Giulia and you're thinking about maybe a Stelvio, this is a pretty good compromise here. You're going to gain a ton of trunk space here. You have a huge area, very easy to get things in and out. The Giulia actually has a pretty decent sized trunk, but it's really difficult to get things in and out because it's just this really small opening. You do have the seats that fold down just about flat. Also have a privacy cover, which is removable. It's a two-piece. You have the second half of it attached to the hatch. I'm guessing they do that just because of the angle of the hatch. But overall, a pretty big space here. If you have the upgraded audio like this one does, you're going to have a subwoofer on here instead of that kind of cubby hole, but you do have the cubby hole on this right-hand side. All right, so back seat space. It's definitely not best in class, but it will work if you need to get people in the back seat. Heated second row in this trim, which is always nice to have. I have my seat where I would be. Normally, I'm not super tall. I'm about 5'10". But reasonable amount of space in here. Pretty comfy, pretty cozy. USB charging ports back here, USB-A, not the newest USB-C, and obviously individual vents. You do have this nice panoramic sunroof back here. Other than that, pretty low frill back here. Always recommend, guys, with an Alfa Romeo, you keep a code reader in the car, you're gonna need it. They should actually just come with them from the factory. So if you've seen the Giulia video that we made, you know that I complained about getting in and out of that car. Pretty difficult to do if you're a bigger person. This solves most of that issue, and I'll tell you why it solves most of it, not all of it. So this trim's gonna have the sport seats, which first off look fantastic. They're very, very bolstered. They have a ton of adjustment. They have lumbar support. They have adjustable bolsters, adjustable thigh support, all that good stuff. They look great. Just a really, really nice looking seat overall. Now, the trouble comes when you get into them. It's not difficult to do, but you kind of have to hop over them. And if you're not really careful, you're gonna do some damage to potentially yourself in a very sensitive area, maybe. Once you're in, honestly, pretty cozy. Like I said, tons of support. And you do have the adjustable bolsters in the back here on the sides. These are pretty much, if I ate a big meal, I probably wouldn't fit into these seats at this point. That's very subjective. It's going to depend on your body shape and your body size. This being an Italian car, they're catering probably towards more petite people. I am not a petite person, so I'm pretty snug in here. My wife, who weighs about half of what I weigh, says that these seats are super comfortable. So again, very subjective, and it's just going to depend on your body type. Once you're in here, a lot more space in the Giulia, guys. A lot more space, which is one of the primary reasons I just couldn't do the Giulia anymore. It's just too tight in there for me. Ton of headspace here. And the other thing I noticed immediately in these cars, you have way more shoulder space in here. The Giulia, my shoulder was absolutely jammed into that B-pillar all the time. Just really super uncomfortable. So one of the big reasons I had to jump into a Stelvio. Same setup in here as the Giulia. Very familiar looking if you've driven a Giulia before. Start button is on the steering wheel. I think it's cool. I like it there. It's easy to forget, though, if you drive other cars, especially. You have some of your assistance features here if you are equipped with those. Lane keep, adaptive cruise control, all those things. Those all work fairly well. I don't use them a ton, but they do work. I think they did a pretty good job on them. You have these absolutely monstrous paddles here. They're almost a little bit too big, honestly. But very, very tactile to use. You get kind of an audible click from them. I really like them. The only issue you're going to run into is when you go to hit your directional, you kind of have to reach over to get to the directional. If you live in Massachusetts, don't even worry about that. You probably don't even know what that is, so I won't go into too many details for you. Don't think you're going to be sacrificing any of that Alfa Romeo character because you're jumping into an SUV here. These still get a ton of attention on the road. I probably get the same amount of attention in this car as I do in the Giulia. You just don't see them very often. People really don't know what these are. Very, very unique looking car. And I'm not a huge SUV fan personally, but I think it looks pretty great. And I think if you have to get an SUV for whatever reason it might be, this is a good compromise. So I think overall fit and finish in here is really, really good. Everything seems to fit well. There's no squeaks, rattles, or anything like that. So this car is optioned with the Harman Kardon upgraded audio and the extended leather package, which is all one package now. So if you want the upgraded audio, you get the leather. And if you want the leather, you get the upgraded audio. I think the extended leather, which gets you leather on top of the door panels here and on top of the dash, I think it definitely elevates the interior quite a bit. I think it's worthwhile. It really just kind of brings it to the next level. And overall quality of the material is pretty good. I don't think this is gonna be comparable to Audi or BMW of the same price range. I think those cars just have nicer interiors. This doesn't, to me, this doesn't feel like a $60,000 interior. But overall, it's pretty good. And it's very just Alfa Romeo. It's a clean design. It's simple. It's laid out pretty well. There's no screens that are in your face. You have a pretty small, I think it's a 9-inch screen in the infotainment system, which it's very similar to how we talked about it in the Giulia. It's not a great infotainment system. It's usable, but it's really not that great, and I honestly try to use it as little as possible because it's pretty laggy and slow, and it just doesn't respond to inputs well. The menus are kind of confusing. It's hard to remember where things are. It's just, yeah, not my favorite. I really wish they did the Uconnect in these cars like they did in the Maseratis. They just ported the Uconnect system over, which is what they should have done here. I understand why they didn't do it. It's because you have obviously a much wider kind of screen here, and I just don't think it would have fit properly. But yeah, it's just a real shame because Alfa Romeo tried to do their own proprietary thing here with this infotainment, and it just didn't go that well. Now, the other thing I want to talk about with the differences with the 24s and the 23s, I've heard mention that they might have made some slight updates to the 24 infotainments. I use a 24 infotainment system. I didn't think it was any better. I thought it was just as laggy. So I don't know what kind of update they might have made there, but I don't think it helped very much. The biggest thing on the interior you're going to notice between the 24s and the 23s is you are going to have now a digital display, digital gauges. The 23s and earlier are going to have the analog gauges with that center screen. I really like the analog gauges. They're just more responsive, and I just think they look better. I'm not a huge fan of the big screen across the board there. I do like that it's configurable and you can change things around a little bit, but I just prefer this. Obviously very subjective. Engine and transmission, same powertrain that's in the Giulia, the 2-liter turbo with 280 horsepower and 306 foot-pounds of torque. It feels a little punchier in the Giulia because you obviously have a bit more weight here in the Stelvio. Generally speaking, the Stelvio is going to be somewhere around 4,000 pounds depending on trim and options. The Giulias are in the 3,600 ballpark, so about 400 pounds difference. And obviously you have a little more drag here just being an SUV. You do feel the extra weight, and just overall you can tell it's just not quite as peppy as the Giulia was. The Giulia felt genuinely quick for what it was. This still feels quick, but it just feels like it needs a little more get up and go to really be an actually quick car. Obviously, you do have the quadrifolio model if you want to get arrested. As far as the engine itself goes, it's a pretty widely used engine in FCA's lineup. I think it sounds pretty good for a 4-cylinder. It's pretty quiet though, really. The stock exhaust is pretty much non-existent. You can't really hear anything. I had a custom exhaust on the Giulia. I do have a Remus exhaust, axle back in a box waiting to go on this car. Someday I'll put it on, but I don't know when that's going to be. That's a pretty subtle exhaust. I don't think you need anything too loud. I think just something subtle where you can just kind of hear the exhaust and the upshifts really is going to suit this car best. I know a lot of people do like muffler deletes on these. I don't know. I don't know if I love the sound. Pretty raspy. You get a lot of interior resonance and drone. Yeah, maybe a nice subtle exhaust on these is really what you're going to want. But if you are a car enthusiast, you're probably going to want at least something, because I think it's just a little bit too quiet. Now we do have the same ZF 8-speed in this car that we had in the Giulia. ZF 8-speed, as you probably know, is used in a plethora of different cars. It's probably one of the best torque converted automatic transmissions ever. It's just really, really good. You can use it in a ton of different applications. It shifts well. It's fairly compact. You know, it can be pretty fuel efficient with all those gears. And with the paddle shifters, really, really quick to shift. Put it in dynamic mode, and we'll downshift, and immediate downshifts. There is pretty much no delay. It's pretty immediate, and there's really no lag at all. I've driven quite a few sports cars that don't respond as well to the paddles as this does, so pretty impressive. Now, if you've seen the Giulia video that we did, you know I complained about maybe some inconsistencies with the shifting calibration and transmission calibrations. That seems to be fixed here. That car, you tended to have some inconsistent downshifts, and some of the shifts were a little more harsh than others. I think it's just about perfect here. There's really no inconsistency. There's nothing to really complain about here. Obviously, your modes, your DNA modes, dynamic, natural, and advanced efficiency are going to change not only where the shift points are, but also how firm those shifts are. So obviously dynamic mode or sport mode is going to have the most firm shifts, and then going down to natural and advanced efficiency, the shifts are going to be quite a bit softer. But even in dynamic, they're firm and you definitely feel them, but they're not harsh by any means. I think they're honestly just absolutely perfect in this. If you're just leaving it in the standard drive mode and you're not using the paddle shifters, it always kind of knows what gear you need to be in. It's always right there ready to go. Natural is a little more slow to respond. It's more kind of oriented for fuel mileage, obviously. But in dynamic, it's ready to go all the time, and it can pretty much read your mind. Now let's talk about probably the best part of this car, which is the steering. The steering is insanely sharp, very, very direct. You always know where your tires are. It almost turns before you even think about turning. It's like telepathically knows when you want to turn. Super sharp and very responsive. If you've driven any of the other kind of competitors' cars, the Q5s, the X3s and things like that, the steering's pretty numb in those, and I think it takes a lot of fun out of the equation. I wouldn't even kind of put this in the same ballpark as those. This feels like a sports sedan, honestly. Now, obviously the steering isn't as good as the Giulia. They kind of dialed back the ratio here a little bit just to kind of suit the car a little more. I think as much as I would enjoy having the Giulia's super sharp steering in this, I think it's well suited to the car here. The Giulia is pretty immediate, and honestly on the highway, the Giulia can be a little fatiguing because of how sharp that steering is. But I think overall they've tuned the steering perfectly to the car. Tons of feedback. When you get to the limit, you can feel it. This particular model, the Veloce, is going to have kind of the mid-tier suspension. You're going to have your standard suspension, your sport suspension, which this one has, and then you have the adaptive, which you're going to find in the Competizione or Estrema and the Quadrifolios. This sport suspension here basically is going to give you the standard spring setup, but you're going to get sport dampers up front. I'm assuming that means that they've firmed them up a bit. And the ride is pretty firm here. I drove a Giulia Sprint before this, like I said, or a base, same thing. I also drove a Stelvio Sprint before I bought this car, and I really found the ride in the Sprint to be pretty comfortable. Obviously you have slightly smaller wheels there too. You have 20s on this one as opposed to I think 18s on the Sprints. Definitely a lot more firm here. It's not jarring or harsh or anything like that, but it's pretty firm. And if you're expecting a marshmallow and you're going to be going back and forth to the Country Kitchen Buffet, you probably should get yourself a Lexus or something like that, because this is not the car for you if you want a nice, soft, cozy ride. This is pretty firm. You feel the bumps in the road, you feel the cracks, expansion joints, and things like that. But with that firmness, you get really sharp handling. The handling in this car, or SUV, is pretty shocking, honestly. When you initially turn in, you kind of uptake a little tiny bit of body roll, which, again, we're in an SUV here. And once you get that initial play out of the suspension, the thing just hunkers right down and it will just absolutely rip through corners. It's pretty shocking, honestly, how well this thing handles. So in our Giulia video, we talked about the IBS system, or the intelligent braking system that the Alfa Romeos have, which is a brake-by-wire system. I did not enjoy it at all in that Giulia. I thought it was pretty laggy, felt really unnatural. You don't have a physical connection between the brake pedal and the actual master cylinder and the rest of the braking system. So depending on how it's calibrated, that's really gonna decide on how the brake pedal feels. It felt totally unnatural to me, and it was honestly almost a deal breaker on why I didn't buy that car. I don't know if they've revised it or updated or recalibrated, whatever they did. It's much better in this car. It feels much more natural. It's more responsive. You don't have to put your foot through the floor to get the thing to stop. These cars do have pretty serious brake hardware on them. They're unbranded Brembos, and they're pretty beefy. And the car stops well, but the way they had it calibrated in the Giulia, it just didn't feel like it had any braking power at all to me. I think it's much, much improved here and definitely livable here. I still don't love how the pedal effort changes with the modes. If you're in dynamic mode, or if you drive the car in dynamic mode a lot, like probably most people do, you get used to that brake pedal effort. When you put it into natural or advanced efficiency, it requires more effort to stop the car, and that can really mess you up when you're used to driving it in one way and then you go to step on the brakes the next and not as much happens. It's not as responsive, so that can really throw you off, and I did not love it in the Giulia. Much, much better here, but still don't like it. Veloce models come with the limited slip rear differential. Unless you're really, really pushing this car to the limits and in low traction situations, I don't think you're really going to know the difference between the standard differential and this limited slip. It's nice to have it though, for sure. Now let's just briefly talk about fuel economy. I know that's probably not the most important factor when you're looking at this car, but that being said, it's not very good. I am averaging about 19 miles per gallon. I do mostly city driving with some highway. It is a 2-liter 4-cylinder. I would expect some better fuel mileage out of it. I think they can do better. but again, probably not why you're buying this car. This is the same chassis that underpins the Giulia, and as you can imagine, it feels pretty similar to the Giulia. I've heard this described as a Giulia on stilts, which I think is a pretty accurate description. It really does have very similar driving dynamics, just a little bit higher center of gravity with a little bit more body roll, and obviously you can feel that extra weight there, but it's not drastic. I would say if you need a fun car, but you need the space, maybe you have a family, maybe you have kids, maybe you have to carry stuff in the back, I think this is a really, really good compromise from the Giulia. Like I said, I don't think you're missing a whole lot of the fun. The Giulia is definitely more fun to drive, there's no question about it. That feels like a sports car, honestly. This feels, like I said, about 80% as fun as the Giulia, and you gain a ton in utility. Obviously some extra ground clearance is nice too, depending on where you live, that might be important to you. All right guys, so we reviewed the Stelvio a little bit. We talked about how it drove, talked about how cool it looks, compared it a little bit to the Giulia, and maybe a little bit to the other competitors like the Q5, the X3, things like that. So if you're coming from a Giulia like I did, I had a Giulia for about 2.5 years, and I've had the Stelvio for about 5 months or so. If you're coming from a Giulia, I hope this video will be helpful in kind of maybe making your decision, and maybe it will make you want a Stelvio, or maybe you'll say, no, it's not quite what I was expecting. I obviously definitely recommend driving one because that's going to be the most important factor. But this car shares a lot of similarities with the Giulia. It's on the same platform, the FCA Giorgio platform, which oddly enough shares underpinnings with the Grand Cherokee and the Maserati Gran Turismo. So there's a pretty broad spectrum there, and that chassis underpins a couple of different vehicles. Obviously Stellantis has taken over now, and I'm sure they'll phase that platform out sooner rather than later. This is still a really, really fun car to drive. Like I said, it's probably about 80% of the enjoyment of driving as the Giulia. Obviously physics kind of come into play here. It's a bit heavier by about 400 to 500 pounds, depending on trims and things like that. It's got a higher center of gravity, so you really can't overcome those things. It's just got a bit more mass overall. But for what you gain in practicality, you're going to gain ground clearance, more usable space. The interior is a lot more comfortable, I think. It's got a lot more shoulder space, headroom, things like that. So especially if you're a bigger person, the Giulia can feel pretty tight, and this solves a lot of those problems. It doesn't entirely fix everything. You still have the issue of Alfa Romeo, just there's not that many of them out there, so the dealership network is pretty poor, and that's a big turnoff for a lot of people. I have a dealership about an hour north of here or an hour south of here, so it becomes kind of a whole day project just to get an oil change done or any type of maintenance. And again, Alfa Romeo doesn't have the best reputation for reliability, so you might be spending more time going to a dealership. I think if their dealer network was better, that would probably be, you'd probably see more of these cars on the road. You've got people that have dealerships that are 2, 3, 4 hours away, and that's just totally, I mean, that's kind of crazy for somebody. That's a total turnoff for a lot of people. But with that, obviously, it's a pretty unique car. It looks really unique and has pretty unique driving dynamics. It drives very much like a sports sedan. It really doesn't feel like an SUV. Having spent quite a bit of time in the competitors like the Q5, the X3, GLC 300, things like that, this is a lot more engaging to drive. Those are probably better SUVs or CUVs, but this is pretty darn close to driving a sports sedan. You're really not losing a heck of a lot here, but you're gaining a lot in space and everything else we already talked about. But this car just feels a lot more special than the competitors. It feels more like it's an occasion to drive it. Every time I get in this car, I feel like I have like the privilege of driving it, you know what I mean? I really, really enjoy it. And I think the majority of people that go out looking for one of these end up being okay with the compromises because of how much enjoyment they get out of driving it. It's totally unique. When you see one on the road, it's either people have no idea what it is and they're curious about it, or they know what it is and they're kind of like nodding their head and they're like, yeah, that's cool. That's an Alfa Romeo. Sweet. Hopefully you enjoy the video, guys. We are going to try to make more videos. I know we say that every time. So we'll have a new video out maybe between like a 2-week period or maybe like a year and a half. We're not really, it could be anywhere in between there. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Hopefully we have something new for you soon. If you enjoyed the video, let us know. If you have comments, concerns, recommendations, if you hated it and you thought it was stupid and you don't want to see my stupid face again, that's fine too. Let us know. I don't really care. That's whatever. Thanks for watching, guys. Appreciate it.